Hello. My name's Dr. Andrew Shaw, and I am a principal geoarchaeologist at Wessex Archaeology. My specialism is the Paleolithic, and that's what I'm going to be talking to you about today. So, the title of my talk is Lost Landscapes and Changing Climates, the Lower and Middle Paleolithic of Doggerland and La Marge. So, what we're going to be looking at in this talk is long-term aspects of climate change and its relationship to the archaeological record, specifically that of the Paleolithic. First of all, I would like to talk about when the Paleolithic was. What you can see here is a slide that shows the Paleolithic record of the British Isles. And as you can see, the area in the dashed outline is the Paleolithic record of Britain, and that basically 99% of human history is covered by the Paleolithic. So it's very much a key period, and it's one that lasts an immense period of time. We're talking about if we start in Africa over 2 million years ago, to the start of the Holocene, the modern geological period we're in, began about 11,000 years ago. And in that time frame, we see lots of changes. We see changes in humans in terms of their evolution. So different species of human are present and they change over the time. That archaeological record changes. In the British instance, we're looking at about 800,000 years of archaeological change. And during that period, the landscapes and environments and climate of Britain and the surrounding and Northern Europe changed radically. And within that context, the environmental conditions altered, and along with the animals and plants who were around at particular periods of time. So it's a long period associated with much climatic and environmental change. In terms of the Paleolithic itself, it can be subdivided into three periods. So you've got the Lower Paleolithic, which in British terms covers the period from about 800,000 years ago to just over 300,000 years ago. The Middle Paleolithic, which follows on from the Lower Paleolithic and lasted up until about 40,000 years ago, and the Upper Paleolithic, which lasted from 40,000 years ago and continued up to 11,000 years ago and the start of the Holocene, the modern geological period we live in today. So it's a long period of time which is subdivided into these multiple periods. In terms of the Paleolithic, we get all sorts of evidence in terms of the archaeology, in terms of how we recreate what humans were doing what at particular times. So what we deal with is artifacts. We have large numbers of stone tools, which make up the bulk of the Paleolithic archaeological record. But occasionally, we also get organic artifacts like the spear point, which is from Clacton in the slide. We also get modified human bones, so bones which have been modified by humans. So in this instance with cut marks on it. So this is the bone of an animal which has been butchered by humans. And more rarely, we also get the remains of the humans themselves. The example in the picture here is the back of a skull, and it's from Swanscombe in Kent. But alongside the archaeology, a key part of the Paleolithic is its environmental record. And what we do as Paleolithic archaeologists is we use this record to recreate what past environments were like in which humans were active. You get all sorts of evidence. This is just to show the range of kinds of evidence you get. So you get large mammals, in this instance a mammoth. You get small mammals as well, these vole teeth, insects, pollen, plant macrofossils, and you also get snails. And we use these animals and plants reflect the environments of particular parts of the Paleolithic. And what this shows as a whole is that humans were present during the Paleolithic in a range of climates and environments. So we get human activity in Britain during temperate phases, so periods of time which are as warm or warmer than today. We also get boreal environments. The analog for this would be somewhere like southern Sweden today. So we've got human activity in those kind of environments, relatively temperate. And then we get occupation during more extreme conditions. We get human activity during tundra environments, and during periods, particularly in the Upper Paleolithic, there's evidence of human activity during what are essentially Arctic conditions. So humans are active during the Paleolithic in a full range of environments. During these periods, so across the Paleolithic in total, the landscapes environments would have changed a lot, but also so would sea levels. So this is a sea level curve for the last 800,000 years, with the peaks showing periods of high sea level and the troughs showing periods of lower sea level. Today, how we date the Paleolithic, we subdivided into something called marine isotope stages. Marine isotope stage 1 being the present day at the right-hand side of the graph, and then going back in time, we have odd and even numbered stages with even numbered stages reflecting warm temperate environments with relatively high sea levels like today, and even numbers reflecting colder periods when sea levels were lower with water locked up in the ice. And this sea level change had a great influence on the landscapes and environments at different periods. The other thing it affected, and this is particularly the case in Britain and Northern Europe, sea level change had an immense impact on paleogeography. So at some period, so the conditions we have today, with Britain being an island, is an unusual one. During long periods of the Paleolithic, sea levels were much lower than today, and Britain was connected to northern France. And these are just a couple of slides which show this. And this is something I'm going to go into in a bit more detail. So because we have this change from Britain being an island like it is today, but during other periods when sea levels were lower and there was this connection between Britain and Northern Europe, there's the way that the Paleolithic record tends to have been looked at is to be this contrast between changing island and peninsula status of the British Isles in terms of its connectivity to Northern Europe. So what this has led to is sort of this kind of perspective of looking at the Paleolithic record in terms of periods when sea levels were low enough for people to access Britain and what these access routes were. So using the archaeological record to see this connection between human populations coming in and out of the British Isles. This is entirely is a very useful way of looking at the archaeological record, but it sort of overlooks one key point, and that is that a lot of the landmass of Northwest Europe, the areas surrounding Britain, France, the Netherlands, and Belgium, which are now sea today, would once have been land. And rather than these simply being routes across which humans would have moved, these were landscapes in which people lived. And we're increasingly seeing how people lived within these now drowned offshore landscapes. So in terms of the region we're looking at in Northwest Europe, we look at these offshore landscape can be subdivided into two areas. Firstly, there's an area termed Doggerland, named after Dogger Bank in the North Sea. So this area between East Anglia and Belgium and Holland, which during low sea level periods would have been land. And also we've got the Channel region, La Manche. This area similarly would have been a landscape through large periods of the Paleolithic, which was occupiable and which people lived within. So just this picture here is a cave site. We're looking out over what is today the sea. The key point to note is that during large periods of the Paleolithic, that would not have been sea. That would have been land, and these would have been landscapes in which humans were active. So what I want to look at now is how the landscapes of Doggerland and La Manche changed over time during the Paleolithic. And a key point in this story is that prior to 500,000 years ago, in the area which is now occupied by the Straits of Dover, there would have been a land bridge, a chalk ridge, which joined southeast England to northern France, and this would have been permanent regardless of sea level. So prior to 500,000 years ago, whatever the sea level change was, humans would be able to access Britain throughout at any period. So, and these reconstructions I'm going to show you now is an overview of how this situation changed over the last 500,000 years. So this is the period before 500,000 years ago, when you've got lower sea levels with a permanent land bridge connecting France and Britain across the Straits of Dover. Now, this situation began to change around 450,000 years ago. During this period, there was a glaciation, a cold period with glaciers extending as far south as the Thames Valley. What this created is in the area of the North Sea is the buildup of this lake behind the ridge which formed the Straits of Dover. And what this caused is the pressure behind that land bridge to create a catastrophic flood event, which started the process of breaching the Straits of Dover. That process was one that lasted for about 200,000 years until we had total breaching of the Straits of Dover, but it's one which was initiated around 450 years ago. So in the period, the next period I just want to show you is the period between 340 and 190,000 years ago. Although the process of breaching the Straits of Dover had started, there was still connectivity even during periods of elevated sea levels. But this is the situation you would have seen it about between 340 and 190,000 years ago, when Britain would have been connected to Northern Europe across the North Sea. Now, about 190,000 years ago, there was another glacial period, and as part of geological processes during that period, that's what led to the full breaching of the Straits of Dover, where you have a situation which you had from 130,000 years ago. During periods of low sea level, people would still have been able to get into Britain across the North Sea, but during high sea level, as in the example here, which is a reconstruction of the period around 130,000 years ago, so which was the last time Britain, that prior to today, that Britain had interglacial conditions similar or even warmer than today, you would have had no connectivity. The Straits of Dover would exist. There would be sea between the North Sea and the English Channel would have existed. But during these periods of low sea level, you would have had a major river running through the area that called the Channel River, which would have drained a lot of northern Europe, draining rivers from the Thames, the Rhine, the Meuse, all draining into this river, which would have flowed through the English Channel. So quite a different set of situations would have existed during different periods of the Paleolithic. And what I want to do now is just explore in a bit of detail a couple of case studies showing what environments were like and how humans occupied these landscapes, and how we look at these lost landscapes of Doggerland and La Manche during two periods of time. The first one is the period prior to 500,000 years ago, before the process that led to the breaching of the Straits of Dover, associated with some of the earliest occupation of Northern Europe, and the period from 340,000 years ago to 190,000 years ago, at the start of the Middle Paleolithic, when we see the emergence of behaviours associated with Neanderthal populations. So the period around before 500,000 years ago is one which we have a rich record of areas which are now round the coasts of Britain, the edges of what would have been the now drowned offshore landscapes. And the key sites I just want to talk about in this period are two sites in East Anglia, Payfield and Haysborough, and Boxgrove in Sussex. So the first site is Payfield, and when this was first discovered in the early 2000s, this was the oldest site in Northern Europe. It's interesting in many reasons, not just because it pushed human occupation back to a period we didn't know that you had human occupation in Britain, but also because of what its climate and environments were like. Based on its rich environmental evidence, the climates that humans were active at this time would have been one like you see in the Mediterranean today, so warm interglacial environments. The site itself was located on the marshy edge of a large river. And this is the kind of environmental reconstruction that you have when humans were around at this time. So Mediterranean with species such as hippo and straight-tusked elephant. And the initial argument was that the only reason humans were able to occupy this area of northern latitudes during this period was because essentially these were warm Mediterranean conditions, similar to where the environments where humans were coming from at that time. So that's an interesting site. A particularly important site, though, was the subsequent discovery of a site at Haysborough 3. Now, first of all, this pushed back the evidence of human occupation both in Britain and Northern Europe to at least 800,000 years ago. But perhaps one of the perhaps even more interesting than the site's age is the environments it was associated with. It wasn't a Mediterranean environment like that at Payfield. It was more a cooler climate, a boreal environment, similar to southern Scandinavia today. So what this was showing is that humans were able to tolerate a much wider range of environmental conditions very early on. Similarly, it's a site located on the edge of a large river, close to an estuary, which would have gone out with the land extending slightly further out than it does today into the area that is the North Sea. One of the other fascinating things from Haysborough is the discovery of these footprints. These footprints discovered in essentially mud deposits on the foreshore are some of the earliest human footprints outside of Africa. And they give us a fascinating insight into how groups operated at that time. It's interesting, within these footprints, you can identify at least 5 individuals, and these individuals include adults and children. So we're looking at family groups from around 800,000 years ago. The other site from this period I just wanted to talk about is the site of Boxgrove in Sussex. This site has got some as rare evidence of in situ primary context archaeology, lower Paleolithic archaeology dating to about 500,000 years ago. And what you have is napping scatters where people were producing tools, and we have the remains of butchered animals. We also have human remains from this site. So this is in the slide here, you can see a tibia, a human tibia. That's one of the things. They also found teeth, human teeth from this site. This site's slightly younger than well, considerably younger in time. So it's about 300,000 years younger than Haysborough. But again, we're seeing human occupation during quite a cold climate, a cool climate at least. And in a coastal environment with open grassland, with lagoons and streams. The other thing about Boxgrove is it's not a single location. What is preserved on the Sussex coastal plain in this area is a paleo landscape with a large area of landscape preserved in which humans were active. So you get different spots within that landscape with people producing stone tools and butchering animals. One of these, an example of this is this GTP 17, or the horse butchery site as it's known. Here you've got in situ napping scatters, so well preserved that you can actually see how people were sitting, as in the case of the napping scatter in the top left here. So it's such a well preserved moment in time from 500,000 years ago. Also, we've got the horse butchery site, are unsurprisingly the remains of the butchered remains of a single large female horse, and this butchered horse is associated with these napping scatters. So you can reconstruct how humans were active at this moment in time, associated with the butchery of the carcass of this animal. So we get these beautiful snapshots in the Boxgrove paleo landscape of human activity in the lower Paleolithic. So this is just a reconstruction of the Boxgrove paleo landscape, where you've got this chalk cliff line in which was a primary source of flint raw material to make hand axes, and this rich coastal environment, this coastal plain in which humans and animals were active. So that's the side of Boxgrove. So that takes us up the 500,000 year period. After that period, around 450,000 years ago, this is where we see the start of the process of the breach of the Straits of Dover. And after this period is the other case study I just wanted to talk about. So this period between 340 to 190,000 years ago. And whereas the sites that I've talked about previously are on the edge of the landscapes of the English Channel and Doggerland. In this instance, we've started to be able to find evidence of human activity within the now drowned landscapes themselves. In the case of Area 240, which I'll talk about in a minute, this is actually located offshore. Whereas in the case of Lakota de Saint-Brelard, this is a site which is located today on the island of Jersey, but which is the archaeology from which tells you an immense amount about the now drowned offshore landscapes of the English Channel. So just looking at just a little bit of information on these two areas. Area 240 is a dredging area off the coast of Great Yarmouth, and from dredging activity, this produced artifacts, so stone tools, as well as remains of animal remains, so faunal material. The deposits here have been shown to be part of the sands and gravels, so fluvial riverine deposits of the Paleo River Yar, and they've been dated to the period between about 320 and 180,000 years ago. And the fascinating thing about Area 240 is really, for the first time certainly in the context of Doggerland in the Paleolithic, we've actually got clear evidence and a site which is located in what's now the drowned offshore landscape. Currently, there are around 100 artifacts which have been recovered through this process that have been dredged up from this area, and well in excess of 100 individual bits of animal remains, so greater than 100 pieces of fauna. These include mammoth teeth, bone fragments, and as you can see in this example of a mammoth skull, you really do get some beautiful preservation of these animal remains in these environments. In terms of the site itself, reconstructions show that it was a cool, open estuarine environment, towards the estuary of the Paleo River Yar, the estuary as it was then. In terms of the archaeology itself, there seems to be two sets of different assemblages, different collections of artifacts. There's a collection of hand axes, which are in very fresh condition, and a collection of Levallois flakes and cores, which are very diagnostic of the middle Paleolithic, which is slightly more abraded. And what this seems to be showing is that you've got several phases of human activity in this offshore landscape. They're not just one-offs. It shows repeated activity in this landscape over a period of time. Moving on to Lakota de Saint-Brelard in Jersey. So what Lakota is this ravine system cut within granite. And within that ravine system is a series of sediments which have been preserved and which contain over 240,000 years of evidence of human activity. The site's been excavated for a long time with large amounts of material removed from the fissure system. So the site's been excavated since 1910 onwards. And it's produced multiple phases of occupation during the early Middle Paleolithic, the period from around 240 to 160,000 years ago. So it reflects multiple phases of occupation. And interestingly, that occupation occurred in different environmental conditions. So lower down in the sequence that we've got is the archaeology and its associated environmental evidence shows that humans were active in a temperate landscape. With one not that different from today. Then we see the environment getting progressively cooler, but still with human occupation. And then we get the two units which are associated with wind-blown loess, which is something you get in periglacial environments where sediments are blown up by Arctic winds and deposited on the land. Now, during these periods, humans seem to be absent, so these peak cold periods. But within that cold period, the period in blue on this map, there is a clear period of climatic amelioration where you get human activity again and another Paleolithic archaeological assemblage. So the strip in brown on this image between the two bits of blue. So it's really a unique sequence and a unique insight into repeated occupation of this place over a long period of time in different environmental conditions and in which the landscape surrounding the site changed. The site's famous for two bone heaps, which are these accumulations of faunal remains, and they're unusual accumulations which consist of specific elements of specific animals. There seems to be two bone heaps, an upper one which is dominated by the scapula of mammoth with some rhino skulls emplaced on top of it, and the lower one which consists of at least, I think it's 13 mammoth skulls alongside a large number of ribs, and these unique and intriguing assemblies have somewhat defied interpretation, but it clearly reflects some unusual activity, but two phases of it over probably a significant period of time. Now, in terms of the archaeology as a whole, there are over 250,000 artifacts which have been excavated from these early Middle Paleolithic deposits at Lakota. One of the interesting things about these lithics is they're on different raw materials. So there's a variable different kinds of stone which has been used to produce the artifacts, very few of which are on raw material sources which are local to the site. And the key thing about this is you can see where these raw material sources are coming from. So, for example, with the flint, we get bedrock sources of flint that have been exploited, and the nearest source of which is 20 kilometers north of Jersey today, under the Normanno-Breton Gulf, so in the area where the sea is today. So because you've got these different raw materials, you can start to look at where humans were active in different periods. So Jersey today is an island. Lakota is on this island, but all the archaeology we're talking about relates to periods when Jersey was not an island, when sea levels were lower. The interesting thing about it, because it's in an area of variable geology, the geology is quite different in different parts of the offshore landscape around Jersey and the Channel Islands. That can be tied into the different raw materials we find from the site. So we're able to use those raw materials to look at where within these landscapes humans were active and how they were, and because of the nature of the archaeology, how humans were active in these now lost landscapes. And this can all be linked together, the differences in landscape use, sea level changes, changing environments, and the archaeology itself allows us to see changes over time. So just as a brief overview, what we can see is, generally speaking, during times like this, when sea levels were high, none of the archaeology we have from the early Middle Paleolithic would relate to a scenario like this. What we'd be looking at is something more akin to this, where sea levels have dropped. There's a series of rivers in these offshore landscapes. In some periods, they were quite. That's in this case, the sea wasn't that far away, but in other periods, we can tie in the changing archaeological record and the raw materials to being used to drops in sea level, where different raw materials become available. And interestingly, what we can see through the archaeology from Lakota is that a lot of the archaeology reflects human activity in a different landscape than the site itself. So the site itself is this granite hard bedrock landscape, whereas offshore you've got where you get different geologies, including Cretaceous geologies where you get flint. This is the landscape which the archaeology seems to reflect, where people were actually active a lot of the time, and they were returning to this ravine system as a source of shelter, as a site to be occupied. But where they were actually mostly active is now within these drowned offshore landscapes. So just to draw all this together, so the evidence that we have from these two groups of sites, so periods dating to over 500,000 years ago, where we've got evidence of activity on the margins of these now drowned environments, and evidence from sites from the period from 240 to 190,000 years ago, Lakota and Area 240, where we're getting evidence of human activity within these drowned environments. What this is all starting to tell us is that these coast areas, which were quite close to the coast in the past, or areas which were open landscapes in the past, these now drowned offshore landscapes, are the key to understanding human activity during these periods. These were important lived environments which have great potential to tell us about human activity during different periods of the Paleolithic, but also how climate changed during that period, and how human activity changed in response to those changes in climate. And this is just a very it's somewhat detailed picture of how this all ties up. And what we're starting to be able to do is to see which periods humans were active in northern France, which periods humans were active in the British record, and tying this all together to see how this relates to a unified record of human activity and behaviour in the offshore landscapes of Doggerland and La Manche. So to summarize, in terms of the Paleolithic, what we can see is what we're looking at is the best part of 800,000 years of change, 800,000 years of climate change, but also 800,000 years of changes in pretty much everything, changes in species, different human populations, changes in landscapes, which varied enormously over this period, as did the environments. And importantly, so did the behaviours. How people behaved at different periods in the Paleolithic would have changed, but in response to various things. But one of the key influences on this would have been the changes in climate. I think an important thing to take away from this is that the situation that we have today, island Britain, disconnected from continental Europe, is actually an oddity. What the Paleolithic record shows is it's during most of the time when humans were active in northern Europe, Britain was connected to northern France, and this island status is unusual, or at least it was unusual. So the way we look at this area and landscape should be a bit different. So essentially what we have today is Britain and northern France are geographic upland remnants of a much wider series of landscapes which would have extended over the North Sea and into the English Channel. And what this would have provided is a single interconnected region in which with human activity across both these upland parts of the landscape, but also fundamentally extensively in areas which are now beneath the sea. So in terms of what we've looked at today, the archaeology from both the periods that we've looked at in the lower and middle Paleolithic, the period before 500,000 years ago and the period between 300 and 160,000 years ago, are reflective of activity on the edges of these lost landscapes, but also we're starting to be able to access archaeological material which reflects activity directly in those landscapes themselves. The archaeology from the edges of these landscapes, as particularly the evidence from Lakota shows us, gives us an opportunity to gain an insight into the landscapes which are now beneath the sea. Furthermore, sites like Area 240, where we're actually starting to get archaeology from within those landscapes, means which we are starting to get tantalizing glimpses of what humans were actually doing in those landscapes themselves. And the key point is that archaeology is present across these landscapes that reflects changing human behavior and changing environments, and that these were, rather than route ways into and out of Britain, they were lived and occupied landscapes. And it's the archaeology of these now drowned, lost landscapes is key to understanding early human evolution and behaviors in northern Europe.